together. And what I titled this session, as Ari mentioned, is Finding God in Nature and Torah. And one of the questions that this psalm, I think, is interested in is, what is the relationship between the type of God we find in nature and the type of God we find in Torah? And just to sort of frame our discussion before we study the text, I want to just give you a couple of questions that are worth kind of filing in the back of your mind as we go. One of them is this: to the extent that you have ever had, or sometimes had, or encounters with God, in what domain of life does that happen? Is it in your experience of the natural world? Is it when you find a new text or a new idea electrifying? Or is it in some kind of personal relationship? Or is it in some combination of those? This psalm is particularly interested in the first two of the three choices I gave you, in the discovery of God in the natural world and the discovery of God in Torah. Okay, now, this is maybe a stranger question to some folks, which, if any, of your senses are involved in those experiences or encounters? Are they visual? Are they auditory? Do they involve your sense of smell or touch in some way? Or are they more, quote unquote, purely cognitive, whatever that exactly means to you? Or are they intuitive? That will also matter a lot as we go through this text. And then thirdly, in some ways, I think the question that this psalm is, I want to say, most directly interested in, but I'm not married to that being true, is the question of what kind of God do these experiences lead you to? Is it an abstract creator? Is it a personal one the other? Is it neither through this text? So again, where do you have such experiences? What senses might they involve? And what kind of God do they lead to? Okay, now what I want to do before we dive into the text is ask for two volunteers. One to read in Hebrew, although if there's no one who feels totally confident in reading Hebrew well and clearly, I'll do that. And then one to read in English. What we're going to do is read one verse in Hebrew, one verse in English, just so you can hear the text read aloud, and then we'll go through it carefully. Can people not hear me?
Yeah, it's good. There's a little bit of interference, I would say, and it's not the best connection. It's not the worst. It's not the best. So I would say let's continue. If I feel it's really bad,
yeah,
we may have you kind of come back in.
Yeah, please, by all means, stop me if that's the case. Rabbi Spitz, how do you feel about reading the Hebrew? You willing to do that? And then can I have someone to raise their hand to read the English? Rabbi Spitz will read one verse in Hebrew, and then you'll read the verse in the English translation. Anyone willing to do it? Faith? That would be great. Thank you. Okay, so we can unmute yourselves. And I'm gonna do my best. It's gonna be a spiritual practice for me. I'm not going to interrupt until we've read the whole psalm. Okay.
So do you want Hebrew first?
Yeah.
L'menatzeach mizmor LeDavid.
Faith, go ahead.
Is this in the handout?
This is the text of the handout. Yep.
Okay.
Psalm 19.
Beginning for the leader?
Yep.
Okay. For the leader, a psalm with David. The heavens declare.
Whoa. We're going to do one verse at a time. Okay.
Okay.
Hashemayim mesaprim kavod elu maaseh yadav magid harakia.
The heavens declare the glory of God.
The sky proclaims
his handiwork.
Yom liyom yabia omer v'layla yechaveh da'at.
Day to day makes utterance. Night to night speaks out.
Ein omer ve'ein devarim b'li nishma kolam.
There is no utterance. There are no sound, no words. Whose sound goes unheard?
B'chol haaretz yatsa kavam u'viktzei tevel melehem lashemesh sam ohel bahem.
Their voice carries throughout the earth, their words to the end of the world. He placed in them a tent for the sun.
והוא כחתן יוצא מחופתו, יסיס כגיבור לרוץ אורח.
Who is like a groom coming forth from the chamber, like a hero eager to run his course?
מקצה השמיים מוצאו ותקפתו על קצותם, ואין נסתר מחמתו.
His rising place is at one end of heaven, and his circuit reaches the other. Nothing escapes his heat.
תורת אדוני תמימה משיבת נפש, עדות אדוני נאמנה מחכימת פתי.
The teaching of the Lord is perfect, renewing life. The decrees of the Lord are enduring, making the simple wise.
פקודי אדוני ישרים משמחי לב, מצוות אדוני ברא מאירת עיניים.
The precepts of the Lord are just, rejoicing the heart. The instruction of the Lord is lucid, making the eyes light up.
יראת אדוני טהורה עומדת לעד, משפטי אדוני אמת, צדקו יחדיו.
The fear of the Lord is pure, abiding forever. The judgments of the Lord are true, righteous altogether.
הנחמדים מזהב ומפז רב, ומתוקים מדבש, ונופת צופים.
More desirable than gold, than much fine gold, sweeter than honey, than the drippings of the comb.
גם עבדך נסהר בהם, ושמרם עקב רב.
Your servant pays them heed. In obeying them, there is much reward.
שגיאות מי יבין, מנסתרות נקני.
Who can be aware of errors? Clear me of unperceived guilt.
גם מזדים חסוך עבדך, על ים שלובי אז איתם, וניקתי מפשע רב.
And from willful sins, keep your servant. Let them not dominate me. Then shall I be blameless and clear of grave offense.
יהיו לרצון אמרי פי, והגיון ליבי לפניך, אדוני צורי וגואלי.
May the words of my mouth and the prayer of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer.
Okay, great. Thank you. So let me orient us a little bit in case this sounded kind of foreign or even just sort of like confusing or vague. This is one of the 3 Psalms of the 150 Psalms in the book of Tehillim. 3 of them are about Torah. That is Psalm 1, Psalm 19, and Psalm 119. Psalm 19 is distinctive in that it connects the wisdom that is discernible in the heavens, in creation, with the wisdom that is discernible in the Torah. And again, that's that question that I mentioned that this text is very interested in. It is not easy to figure out sort of what genre of poem this is, if that's the kind of question that interests you. Verses 2 to 11 appear to be some kind of hymn or 2 hymns. And then in praise of divine wisdom, first the divine wisdom as expressed in nature, then the divine wisdom as expressed in Torah. And then the rest, and then verse 12 to 14, are more like a petition for forgiveness, for enlightenment, something like that. It becomes a personal prayer. And again, we're going to see the relationship between all these pieces in just a few minutes. Now, in order to pay homage to the world of academia, I will just say that most scholars think that this psalm, as we have it, which is part of the Shabbat and Yom Tov liturgy, was originally 2 or 3 separate poems that were brought together. And one of the reasons for that, as we'll see, is that the name of God is different in each of them, that some of the kind of the poetic structure is different. But what is really important is that actually, even if it's brought together from different pieces, this is a very clearly, I think, coherent poem that is interested specifically in the relationship between the parts. And if you know anything about academic study of Bible, there was a time when the study of Bible, when what all people did was essentially deconstruct a text into earlier texts. And now people spend much more time on, yes, but there's a finished product to really work through here. So let's think about this poem as a unified text and a unified poem. One of the questions that I'll just also throw out there for you to think about as we begin to transition towards reading this through carefully is, does the juxtaposition of nature on the one hand and Torah on the other suggest that Torah is somehow universal in its scope, in its intent, right? It is very common in rabbinic literature, for example, to think Torah is the document that is about the intimate and private relationship between God and the Jewish people. But there are also strands of rabbinic literature that say, no, Torah was created and given lechol ba'ei olam, to all people in the world. And one of the questions I think we can ask about this is the parallel between creation and Torah here in part a way of suggesting that somehow, and we can debate exactly how, but that somehow Torah, like creation, is universal in its implication or its goals? And that's a question I think you can ask yourself very, almost very intimately about your own relationship to Judaism. Are the texts of the Jewish tradition only particular, addressed to a particular community, and or are they also somehow addressed to humanity as a whole? Okay? Now, I'm going to say something now that's going to sound totally obscure, and it'll become clearer as we go. Many scholars like to think that the first 7 verses of this psalm were originally a Canaanite hymn to the sun. That may be, but in fact, what is important about this is that this is a classically biblical undermining of that idea. Because as you'll see, the whole point of this first part is the sun is not worshipped. The sun, in fact, worships. Nature is not God. Nature is God's. That is to say, God apostrophe S. Nature belongs to God. Okay? And let's with that, let's look at the text itself and let's see what we come up with. Okay, so I'm gonna just kind of go through this pretty carefully, and I'll stop every little while to take some questions. Ari, if there are amazing questions in the chat, maybe you'll let me know. I know some of my colleagues have somehow figured out a way to follow the chat as they're teaching. I don't understand it. I can't do it. I really don't understand it. It's amazing to me. La menatzeach mizmor leDavid. For the leader, a psalm of David. Just to sort of make you crazy, I'll just say that the word leDavid is enormously difficult to translate. We don't know what it means. It does not mean probably by David. It might mean for David. It might mean in the style of David. It might mean for the king who was a descendant of David. Even this basic word introducing the psalm, we're not totally sure what it means. Lots of possibilities. Okay? Hashamayim misaprim kevod el. The heavens declare the glory of God. Uma'aseh yadav magid harakia. And the firmament or the sky proclaims God's handiwork. Now, notice here, this is not human beings looking at the heavens and telling the glory of God. Like if you're familiar with Psalm 8, the psalmist goes outside at night, looks at the heavens and is like, whoa, let me tell you all about God. This is not the psalmist talking about God, but rather the psalmist perceiving or imagining the heavens themselves telling the glory of God. Nature itself is engaged in a praise of God. This is a widespread notion that I think in our secularized world is sometimes hard for people to connect to, but it is really fundamental to the biblical worldview. And that is that every created thing, not just people with consciousness, every created thing has the capacity as a creature to acknowledge its creator. And a major theme in Psalms that we see in Pesukei DeZimra in the preliminary prayers of the Shacharit service are actually about, in some ways, the idea that nature is involved in a kind of cosmic chorus. And in fact, by the way, people who are interested in environmentally conscious theology are very interested in these texts because they talk about how if the whole world is an orchestra praising God, you can't kill off some of the musicians and expect the music to remain as good. Right? This is a kind of like a biblical argument for the centrality of environmental thinking. Okay? Now, Let's go to verse 3. Yom liyom yabia omer, v'layla lilayla yichavedat. This is very difficult Hebrew. Day to day, some kind of utterance pours forth, and evening to evening, wisdom is expressed. What kind of wisdom? We don't know. The verbs here are actually participial forms, which I know everyone's very excited to go back to 6th grade grammar, but participial forms meaning they express continuous action. In other words, I could have translated this verse as the heavens go on declaring the glory of God, and the sky keeps on proclaiming God's handiwork. In other words, this is not a thing that happened once. This is not a one-time experience where, oh, I looked at nature this one time and it blew me away. This is a description of the natural world that is purportedly constant. This is what nature does. Nature praises God. Okay? And then we see in verse 4, very, very difficult to translate. Ein omer ve'ein dvarim bli nishma kolam. JPS translates. I want you to hear the difference between these two translations. It's actually extremely important. The JPS translation, which you heard, there is no utterance, there are no words, whose sound goes unheard. I think that's probably wrong. More likely, there is no utterance, there are no words, their voice is unheard. Meaning, the JPS version imagines that the heavens are talking and it's always heard. There is no utterance that isn't heard. Whereas what I'm suggesting, and many scholars suggest, is there is no utterance because they're not actually saying anything. In other words, this is the delicious paradox. The heavens are declaring the glory of God, but they are not doing so using words. Or, if I can say it a different way, the religious experience of this psalm is that the visual is experienced as auditory. Let me say that in normal person's language, right? What I see, I experience as hearing. I look at the sky and it's magnificent, and I hear it as saying, God is amazing, right? This is not only, I think, linguistically better than the JPS translation, it's also intuitively better. I'm not sure what the JPS translation actually really imagines the experience is. The sun and the sky are talking, and everyone can hear it. But that's just not true. The sky and the sun are talking if we work to perceive what otherwise would be silence. Give me a nod if you follow me. Yeah? Okay. So again, this notion of the visual becoming auditory. Remember what I asked you about what senses are involved in your experience of God. So, this is an unhelpful question, but would you categorize this as a visual experience or as an auditory experience? I think the correct answer to that is probably yes. But it's some kind of perception as if the heavens were talking. The heavens don't
Can I
act.
stop you for 1 second just to ask a question and give people time
Please.
to take in what you just taught us? When you're reading Psalms like Psalm 19, and are you reading multiple translations and then trying to choose your best translation, like you just showed us different translations, or are you reading it kind of your own way and coming up with your own interpretation, then looking at the other translations to see which one is best, or is it kind of a mix to get to that point you just got us to 5 seconds ago?
It really depends. It used to be that I always started with 4 or 5 translations open and tried to work out how are they arriving at each one, how is each one arriving at their translation. Now sometimes I sort of do my own thing. Here, I didn't really understand the JPS, and I looked at other translations and thought, oh, that makes much more sense, and that actually fits the Hebrew better. Okay? Anybody else have a question before we go on? I don't see you. Feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to do that. Either the formal raising your hand or the actual raising your hand. Yael, you wanted to. Yael and Ruth, and then we'll go on. Okay. but you have to unmute.
I think we should expand the translation even more broadly. When we say dvarim, it doesn't have to be a spoken anything. It also, a davar is a mashu, it's something. So
although in the parallelism of the Hebrew, ein omer ve'ein dvarim sounds like dvarim there means words, right? Because omer is utterance. And in
not only.
Yeah, in the word in biblical Hebrew, omer can mean two things. To
Well,
think
it's
or
also
to,
refers to. It indicates. You could translate it as indicates if you look at it more broadly.
I'm not sure in biblical Hebrew you can do that. But the point is here that you have here classic biblical Hebrew parallelism where the two phrases mean similar things. I mean, you can do I think a very beautiful midrash around dvarim meaning words. I think you could say something quite powerful about dvarim meaning things. I don't think you can sustain that as a reading of this verse. I'm sorry to say, I don't think you can do it as the plain sense. Ruth?
I'm going back a little bit to your introductory remarks and your remarks about Torah as it is referred to in the later part of the psalm. And it's kind of knocking on a door in my head to later Greek ideas of natural law. And I'm wondering if there is some, simpatico there, or how they differ, how these concepts differ.
Yeah, okay, so that's a really profound question, actually. I don't think what you have here is natural law. I think what you might have here is what's called natural theology. That is the idea that the natural world itself testifies to God, and that you don't need revelation in order to have some intuitive awareness of God. I think the question that will be left for later on is, can nature give you access to the same God in the same way as revelation can? And there I think the text will say something rather nuanced and subtle. So there's something to what you're saying, but I would think of this. Natural theology is basically an expression for that which I think I can know about God without any revealed text. Right? So let's say I believe in the argument from design. Let's just do, a random example, right? That the design of the world suggests a creator. So I can arrive at, supposedly, some intuition of a divine creator and designer through the natural world without referring to any religious texts. Right? That's natural theology. That's, Ruth, what I would be willing to say here slightly more conservatively than maybe you were putting it. Verse 5, B'chol haaretz yatsa kavam. Nobody's quite sure what the word kavam means. Usually it's taken to refer to the Arabic word for voice. It may also just be a lamed that fell out. B'chol haaretz yatsa kolam, right? Throughout the whole earth, their voice goes out. Uviktsei tevel milehem. To the very end of the earth, its words go. Again, more words for words here, okay? And then this very interesting conclusion, La Shemesh Sam Ohel Bahem, which, unless you're kind of inside the ancient Near East, sounds like a really weird idea. What does that mean? God built a tent for the sun in the heavens. Well, one thing that we know is that in the ancient Near East, it was often imagined that there were these elaborate dwelling places for a god or a godlike figure. But here, what is underscored by the psalm is the sun does not make its own tent. It's not a god. God makes a tent for the sun. That is to say, God is the one in charge here. This tent is a tent, not a house for a god. Okay, and then verse 6, we're getting to where this is going to transition in a moment. Verse 6 has this interesting visual image, actually a pair of visual images. V'hu kechatan yotzei michupato, and the sun is like a groom coming forth from his marital canopy, from the chuppah. By the way, it's a beautiful image. The idea is that the radiance of the sun is like the face of a chatan who's just gotten married. What I love about that is the text is not saying the face of a chatan who's just gotten married is like the sun, but rather making the opposite claim. Oh, you know what you know what a chatan looks like. I'll tell you what the sun looks like. The sun looks like a sun going out, a chatan going out of his chuppah. Yasis kegibor larutz orach. He is like a hero, eager to run his whole course. And it's probably significant here that the word yasis, to rejoice, is used a few times to refer to the delight that a person takes in worshiping God. And here again, the connotation is that the Son is a worshiper of God. To belabor this point, the Son is not God, the Son is God's. The Son belongs to God. Now, something that you might find interesting about this is that if you had asked a biblical scholar 40 years ago, they would have said to you, this is a text that is polemicizing against, arguing against Canaanite religion. The Canaanites worshiped natural aspects of the natural world, and we reject that. Now, if you ask most biblical scholars, they'll tell you, this is not a polemic against Canaan. This is a polemic within the ancient Israelite community, where some people said, look, to worship God, Yud-He Vav-He, is to worship God and God only. Hashem Echad, God only. And other people said, you know, I already have a large pantheon. I'm thrilled to add Yud-He Vav-He to the pantheon. I'll worship the sun, I'll worship the moon, and I'll worship Yud-He Vav-He too. And whoever wrote this psalm is essentially saying, no. The gods, the other gods that you're talking about, they themselves participate in worshiping God. There's only one who's worthy of worship. Okay, so that's the struggle. And by the way, the book of Deuteronomy is sort of all about this. The book of Deuteronomy is a struggle to say, in ancient Israel, if you're worshiping Yud-He Vav-He, if you're worshiping God, there is nothing else you can worship. And by the way, at the risk of waxing sermonic for a minute, God forbid, heaven forfend such a thing, I think it's worth also thinking about what are the ways in which people in our own world who aspire to worship God also worship lots of other gods at the same time. The God of heaven and earth and the God of the market, the God of heaven and earth and the God of nationalism, the God of heaven and earth and whatever, you fill in your blank. And the one suggestion I would make is resist thinking about this as what you'd criticize other people for, and ask yourself what you'd criticize yourself for. What are your other gods that you worship alongside Yud-He Vav-He? Okay? Now, what I meant by saying that there are two images here is that you have the image of a bridegroom coming out of his canopy, and then you have like a military hero dashing across the battlefield. Both images of kind of like this masculine, I don't even know what, not God as masculine, but God being worshipped by these valiant men. Okay? Now, one more verse in this context. Miktzeh hashamayim motza'o, right? Its rising place is at one end of the heaven, utkufato al tzotam, and his circuit reaches the other. This, by the way, is totally picturing, of course, the sun revolving around the earth. The sun rises in one place and sets in another. Ve'ein nistar mechamato. And this is, so for those of you who have Hebrew, or strong Hebrew, one of the things I want to point out about biblical texts in general is that they cannot resist beautiful puns. And this text has a few beautiful puns. One of them is ve'ein nistar mechamato, literally means nothing escapes from its heat. But chama is also a synonym for the sun. Hachama, birkat hachama, the blessing over the sun. So ein nistar mechamato, nothing escapes the sun's sun. Nothing escapes the sun's heat. Biblical Hebrew loves this so much. In a minute, we're going to see what I would argue, for whatever it's worth. I mean, this is obviously a subjective judgment. The most beautiful pun in the Hebrew Bible, we're going to get to in just a minute. It is magnificent. Okay? Now, all of a sudden, we get to verse 8, and this very strange thing happens where we think we're in a totally different poem. Torat Adonai timimah meshivat nafesh. The teaching of the Lord is perfect. The word Torah Later Jewish interpreters will come to think of this as that it's about the Torah, since after all, David comes after Moshe. But in a text like this, Torah means instruction. It means divine teaching. It is not a particular text that we're talking about. And by the way, one of the prime weapons in the history of Christian caricatures of Judaism is the impulse to translate Torah as law, which is just plain wrong. That is because early Greek translators translated Torah as nomos, which became law. And you still see in some Bible translations that Torah is translated as law, capital L. But lehorot, a moreh, is an instructor. Torah is instruction. It is teaching. It is much more. It includes law for sure, but it is much more than that, more expansive than that as well. So we have here this statement. We'll see what's going on here in a second. Torah Adonai timima mishivat nefesh. So mishivat nafesh, because it's a puzzle. The Torah of God is pure. It restores the soul. Edut Adonai ne'emana machkimat peti. The decrees of God are enduring or faithful. They make the simple person smart or wise. Okay? Bekudei Adonai Yesharim, God's precepts, the laws that God teaches us are upright. Misamchei lev, they delight the heart. One of the things that I talk about a lot when I have the privilege of lecturing before Christian audiences is that the single thing that Christians historically have understood least about Judaism is the idea of simcha shel mitzvah, of the delight of being commanded. The notion here, Pekudei Adonai Yesharim Misamchei Lev, God's laws, they make the heart skip a beat because they're so delightful. Again, we don't know yet how this connects to what we've just seen. Mitzvat Adonai bara me'irat einayim. The instruction or command of God is clear. It enlightens the eyes. It lights up the eyes. Here you see a connection already between Torah and the sun. Me'irat einayim. The Torah is a source of or, of light. Okay? Now, in the next verses, we're going to transition to describing the Torah as pleasurably delicious, for lack of a better way of putting it. The Torah's, Robert Alter uses the term here, sensually luscious. Okay? Now, and one of the questions I think about all the time is, what would it take to restore American Jews to a sense of the Torah as almost impossibly delicious? Right? So let's read this for a minute. I'm gonna start with verse 11. Hanem nechmadim mizahav umipazrav umitukim midvash venofet sufim. The way the JPS doesn't capture this so well, the way this structure works is something like, it is better than X, better even than Y. So the way you would translate in biblical Hebrew, hanechmadim mizahav, they are more pleasurable than gold, more pleasurable even than fine gold. They are sweeter than honey, sweeter even than the drippings of the honeycomb. Okay? And then comes this pun that I can't quite convey to you how beautiful I think this is. Gam avdecha nizhar bahem. That literally means your servant is careful about them. Lihizaher, to be careful. I'm careful with your mitzvot. Except that the student of biblical Hebrew who's really paying attention and reading slowly, students at Hadar know they get tired of hearing this from me. However slowly you read by nature, what it takes to read text well is to learn to read even more slowly. So what the other meaning of Zayin Hey Resh as a Hebrew root is light. Gam avdecha nizhar bahen. Your servant is lit up by them. Your servant is set on fire by them. Your servant is, we could fill in different versions of this. So, and there, by the way, there's a pun connecting the two parts of the psalm. Right? It's not just mi'irat einayim. It doesn't just bring light to the eyes. It sets my whole being aflame. Okay? and then he switches b'shomram ekev rav, and in observing them, there is great purpose. There is great reward, if you will. Although I don't think it means reward as in God will reward me. I think it probably means more, there is an inherent reward in keeping them. Now, so far I'm asking you to keep in mind, what's the relationship between the first part, this psalm about the sun and the created world and the heavens praising God, and then this little poem about the sensual wonderfulness of God's instruction, which is totally pure. Now, all of a sudden, comes this prayer. Gam avdechani's harbahem. Yeah, your servant is very careful with them. B'shomram ekev rav. There is great reward in observing them. Shigiot mi yavin ministarot nakeni. Who could possibly know about sins that they didn't realize they were doing, unintentional, unconscious sins? We could have a whole discussion about what is an unconscious sin. That's not necessarily an intuitive idea in a modern Western context. Ministarot nakeni, please clear me of sins that are hidden from my knowledge. The things I don't even know I should apologize for. And then verse 14, I'm going to come back in a second and explain what's happening here. Gam mizedim chasoch avdecha, which can either mean from intentional sins bizadon, protect me, or from intentional sinners, save me. Keep me from people who are insolent, who are actively defying your will. I don't want to be around them. Al yim shiluvi, let them not rule over me. Az etam, then I will be pure. And this is a transition to the end because etam comes from the word tamim, which among other things refers to a sacrifice being unblemished. Then I will be like an unblemished sacrifice to you. Talk about that in a minute, what that might mean. V'niketi mipesharav, and I will be totally cleansed of all sins. And then the ending, Yula ratzonim refi, here again, sacrifice language. Yula ratzon, this of course you know from the end of the Amida. Yula ratzon may literally may they be acceptable before you or desirable before you. But the thing in the Bible that is described as ratzon is a sacrifice. Olotehem v'zivchehem yula ratzon al mizbechi, says Zechariah, the prophet. Right? So may the words of my mouth and the intention of my heart be like a desirable sacrifice before you. One of the things that I would like to propose, and I can't prove this, I have no way of proving this, is that the reason this verse gets attached to the Amida is because this verse is one of the first places where prayer is described as an equivalent replacement for sacrifice. It is a way to become tamim, and it is a way to do something liratzon. And so when I pray, it is as if I have brought a sacrifice. When I pray, I become the unblemished. When I pray honestly, that is to say, right? Not when I mouth words or, wait eagerly for Kiddush or whatever, but when I'm really praying, I become, in some sense, the substitute for the sacrifice. Now, what is going on here, right? What is this poem? This poem is so weird, right? First we had the natural world praising God. Then we had this great poem about God's teaching. And then we have this deeply personal meditation, reflection, prayer. Please, God, clean me, cleanse me, and make me pure. And I want to suggest, and then I hope we can have some back and forth about this, that the psalm actually, among other things, wants to teach something really interesting, which is if you look back at the first part, you saw in verse 2, Hashamayim misaprim kivod el. The heavens declare the glory of El. El is a generic ancient Near Eastern term for God, for a God. And it is only when you get to God's instruction that you see the word introduced, Yud He Vav He. Torah, and then Adonai. That's verse 8. Torah Adonai. Torah Adonai, the teaching of Yud Hey Vav Hey. In other words, here's the really interesting claim that this psalm wants to make, among other things, beyond being a liturgical piece, beyond inspiring certain experiences. I think it also wants to make a case. And that case is, in the natural world can get you to a creator, but it can't get you to a personal God who cares enough about you to give you instruction and who wants you as an individual to stand before God. In other words, the transition from nature to revelation is a transition from El to Adonai, a transition from a generic God to a personal God, from a creator to a lover. In other words, on the one hand, the psalm says, don't scoff at nature. Nature can reveal God to you. But it's not going to get you to a God who says, you know what, Anita, I'm so grateful that you want to be better. Let me help. Nature can't get that. A campfire doesn't get you a personal God who sees your inner world. For that you need, so this text claims, revelation. Texts from a personal God speaking in some sense personally. And I think there's something really interesting about that, because on the one hand, a psalm is not a philosophical argument, right? A psalm is a prayer, it's an experience, it's an attempt to elicit certain experiences from us. But I think this is also a psalm that is instructional. It is trying to make a philosophical point, and it is one, I think, that is strikingly, in my opinion, strikingly contemporary. Because, when I spend time with young Jews and I say, where do you have an experience that you would call an experience of the divine? Many of them will say, when I'm hiking in the hills. And sometimes I'll say, does the God you discover there forgive you for how you talked to your girlfriend yesterday? No, well, that God is more, it's just awe. That's awe. Okay, but what about intimacy? What about a God who knows you, as opposed to you and everyone else who's hiking up that hill? And that is what I think this psalm is really interested in. That again, it doesn't want to say, oh, there's no God in nature, that's paganism. Quite the contrary. Even the natural world is praising God. But it's not the whole way. And there's a perhaps, I'm not married to this. In fact, I'm not even sure I buy this, but I'm going to try it out on you and then stop and take questions and comments. The last phrase, Adonai Tzuri v'Goali, O Lord, my rock, and you would translate Goali as my redeemer. But in biblical law, the Goel, who is the Goel? When someone, let's say, loses their field and someone else is obligated to help bail them out, the Goel is a relative. Or when someone is killed, right, in the old blood feud texts, which are obviously quite disturbing in many ways, but like the Goel Hadam is the relative of the person who was killed. And one of the questions we might ask is whether calling God Goali is a way of saying about God, not only that God is my redeemer, but also that God is my next of kin. God is my family. God is the one who is related to me, exactly what nature can't get me. End psalm. Adonai Tzuri v'Goali. Okay, I want to hear questions, responses, thoughts, reflections, meditations, whatever. Let's see what we get here.
So I have a few things for you. I've been reading through. So Bimya had 2 points on the first part of the psalm, where we kind of have this trying to understand nature and hearing, seeing how that works. She points to revelation in the biblical text where things are mixed up, where senses are mixed up, and so she draws that comparison. I think that's a good one.
One of the things that you can talk about in certain, like at Sinai, there is what psychologists call an experience of synesthesia, right? V'chol ha'am ro'im et hakolot, and the nations and the whole people saw the voices. I think if this is synesthesia here, it's synesthesia in a minor key, but it may very well be that. Yeah, thank you, Ari. Go ahead.
Another thing that Bimya brought up, I liked, was quoting her here, it shows a natural progression of commitment to Hashem, the way I think Avram became Abraham.
Meaning that Abraham went from seeing God in nature to being in a personal relationship with God.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting. That's more of the midrashic and philosophers Abraham than it is the biblical Abraham. But that's actually quite profound. I mean, Maimonides describes Abraham discovering God by contemplating the natural world and ending up at a first cause. So that's a really interesting observation. Thank you. Others?
If anybody wants to raise their hand, they could do that as well, or chat. My guess is people are taking it in and digesting.
Yeah, no, that's
your teaching today. We have a hand, so let's see who is.
I don't see that.
Oh, Bimya. Okay, so we'll ask Bimya. Go ahead, Bimya.
Thank you. I was curious about the Hebrew for Goali at the end. Would that be similar to in the story of Ruth, the kinsman redeemer?
Mm-hmm. Same word.
Okay. Okay, because I don't really have any Hebrew much, but it sounded like a similar word. So
yeah, and there too, of course, the redeemer is who's the closest relative. That's the question, right?
Correct. Yes. And so thank you, because I had asked the question about Avram becoming Abraham, and it was the midrashic sort of progression of him from looking at nature and how he was able to get to
Right.
revelation of God as a personal God, because I think God would have had to sort of drop natural hints before revelation, because there's a lot of time that goes between like the creation of the universe and then when we get Torah. Otherwise, you wouldn't even have any hints to lead you. And I don't think someone that loves us that much would just sort of abandon us to figuring it out without dropping some wisdom pearls along the way, so we could sort of find that.
What you're saying, in a way, sounds a lot. One of the things I wrote about in my book about Abraham Joshua Heschel is that his understanding of what wonder at the natural world does is that it opens me up to the possibility of revelation. Otherwise, in other words, I see the world, I think, oh my God, this is the most beautiful thing I've been given. What can I do to pay it back? And then revelation comes and says, oh, I'll tell you. But without nature, let's assume someone comes to you and says, hey, you know what God wants from you? Your answer might be, I don't remember asking that question. I don't care. Right? There's the way that the first stage opens me up to the question that the second stage answers. And I think what you're saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, is actually quite similar to that.
Yes, it is. Because I was given by my mother this little rock. And I thought, wow, this is very pagan of you. Just honestly, that was like my first thought. And then when I looked up what the rock was, it came with a little piece of paper. It was actually lithium when it's ground up and used in a pharmaceutical sense. Because it's like, she's like, oh, I bought it. You're supposed to hold it, feel nice and relaxed and calm. And I thought, wow, that is really my rock. Like, I mean, I think that's why we use those natural terms when we refer to Hashem, because otherwise, how would we get that? How would we get from the nature to the divine?
Great. Yeah. By the way, so notice here, oh Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Rock is impersonal, and redeemer might be as personal as it gets. There's an interesting juxtaposition there, right? Yeah, Ruth, you wanted to get in here.
Yeah, I noticed that both the word Torah and the word mitzvah in this psalm are translated by JPS in the context of teaching, education, elucidation, clarification, and some kind of maybe clarity coming from divinity. And I'm not sure how to make the connection between these words in the basic meaning form that I have always learned them, as both being in this context of education.
Well, it might help to say that this psalm scholars tend to imagine is part of wisdom literature, where some of those terms that we think of in more mitzvah means commandment kind of thing, right? Those terms have more general wisdom connotations when they're used in certain settings. Torah means generic instruction rather than the revelation of a particular text. It has to do now. One of the dangers is that can become circular. You assume that a text is from a certain genre of writing, and then you interpret the words that, lo and behold, confirm that it's that genre of writing. You always have to be careful about that. But that's what's guiding them here, is that the language here feels like wisdom language to them. Wisdom meaning, in other words, that in the ancient Near East, there was, across cultures, this notion that there were certain things that were knowable about God, that didn't depend on the particular history of Israel. Now, what's complicated here is that I think at a certain point, this transitions to being specifically about the specific history of Israel. So I actually find your question quite hard in this context, because I don't know where between verses 8 and verse 12, I'm supposed to assume I've gone from generic wisdom to God's revelation to the Jewish people. I'm stuck on that myself. I mean that in a non-rhetorical way. I'm not really sure. Still something about this text that bothers me. I can't quite crack it. Rosa Berman?
Before we get to Rosa, Jill online noted that isn't Rosh Hashanah the birth of the world, nature, and then we get to Pesach, the birth of the Jewish people, our personal relations with Hashem. In other words, she sees this continuity in our own celebration of these holidays.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, I mean, one of the things that you can find online, if you're interested, lectures that I've given about how Pesach is in fact in part about a victory of creation over the enemies of creation. And so I think that the universal theme and the particular theme are deeply intertwined. In other words, we don't leave behind one to go to the other. We situate the other inside the one. That is to say, the particular is situated inside the universal. Okay, Rosa.
Yes,
And
thank
Ari,
you.
I'm relying on you to end whenever you want to do that.
Okay, so I've been studying Kabbalah recently with my rabbi, Nicole Guzik. And so the first few verses had a sense of the Kabbalistic sense of the creation of the world and this light that goes the infinite God, where it says going from the words go from to the end of the world, back and forth and so on, and then the light from the sun. So, and then you go into the teaching. So the tikkun, the Torah is what allows you to do the tikkun, the repair of the world. So somehow the whole psalm has some Kabbalistic feeling in my eyes.
Yeah, I think if we want to approach that historically, we would say it in the opposite way, which is, right, that the Kabbalah picks up on certain themes that are already present in this psalm, right? Rather than, you know what I'm saying? In other words, it's not that the psalm is Kabbalistic, it's that Kabbalists find certain themes in this psalm that resonate with their worldview. Does that make sense, the distinction I'm making? Yeah, okay. Marianne? Or
Before
actually, you're not Marianne.
Before we get
but...
there, a question for you. In verses 8 through 10, there's 6 words for teaching / revelation. How do you understand the differences between the words that are chosen or used?
Yeah,
I guess
I'm not sure that in a poetic kind of almost like a fusion like that, making the distinction among those definitions is actually what's wanted here. I think those words may be a piling up of synonyms, all of which make the same point. One of the things that's challenging about biblical poetry goes back to what I said earlier in response to something that someone mentioned earlier, that biblical parallelism sometimes is about sort of just repeating the same thing that was said in another way, and sometimes is about intensifying it. And you have to kind of decide what you think is happening here. I am not sure, at least at this stage, that the psalmist expects us to sit and parse Torah versus Edut versus Pikudim versus Mitzvah versus Yirah, which doesn't fit. By the way, many Bible scholars, I don't think you should do this, but many Bible scholars amend yirat to imrat, which would fit better, right? Teaching, statement, something like that. So Ari, I'm in a way evading your question by saying I'm not sure it's exactly the question that the psalm is interested in.
I give credit to my question to Rabbi Spitz. He just asked me, and I thought it
Yeah,
was good
so I'm
question.
not sure, Ellie. I'm always tempted by that question, and I'm not sure it's the right question.
So we are out of time, but we're going to go in a little bonus time because it's our last program, just for a few minutes. If it's okay, Rabbi Held, just a few more
Yeah.
minutes because we have 2 more questions before we get there. If the, I have actually heard the same thing you said, where I've particularly with the younger group and we do have a CSP camping program, and I've heard that they feel closest to God or had a God moment in nature. It seems to be a more common thing we hear today among the younger generation. Are they getting stuck at a certain part of this, the point they're trying to teach us here today? And if so, why? Is there something going on these days? And so people are getting stuck at that first part of nature and not moving on to the second part and the third part of the psalm?
I think that could be its own discussion. I will just say 2 quick things about it. One is, it doesn't surprise me that people get stuck at a pre-personal understanding of God, because it's God's personalness that raises questions of, say, theodicy and evil and suffering. And so I think people kind of getting stuck with a generic creator God actually makes some sense. And I would also say, and this is perhaps a terrible thing to say, and I hope the rabbis on this call will forgive me for saying this, I also think we've let down several generations of Jews for whom we have not made Torah electric. They don't have the experience of texts lighting them on fire and making them want to live their life in a totally elevated new way. We've failed them. So of course they don't find God there. And I don't, there's some wonderful rabbis on this call. I'm not trying to obviously cast aspersions. I just think as an American Jewish community, we have failed in very spectacular ways. That's a discussion I'd be happy to have sometime with anyone who wants to have it. Not to talk about why we failed, but to talk about what we might do to succeed.
Thank you. I'm going to give Ahuva Ho. She had raised her hand. I inadvertently took it down. Ahuva, do you have a quick question? Then we'll go to Alida and then Harvey, and then we'll wrap it up. Ahuva?
Yes. I see in this psalm few very interesting things, elements. And I see here a division of 3 sections. The first 2 are connected. The third is connected by the word gam, which is very typical in the Bible to show that it was added later. What I see here is a lot of a focus on communication through speech. The first part is how nature communicate with each other by soundless speech. And this reminds me of the revelation of God to Elijah on Mount Horeb, which he said, I don't communicate with God, with the people through nature, through disasters, natural disasters, but through called mamadaka, a very soft sound. And this is, I think, what it means here, that nature communicates with called mamadaka with each other. Unlike God, and we see it in so many verbs here of speech.
Okay.
We have, I just take Omer and Dvarim, which I call Omer and Diburim, which means that Vayomer Adonai el Moshe lemor, typical. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. We have the Amar and Dabar, Diber, which is typical to communication between God and Moses.
Let me say just a couple of very quick things in response to this. One is, one of the ways to break up this psalm is to think about it as 3 sections. The first section is words about God. The second section is words from God. And the third section is words to God. I think in many ways that's a helpful way of playing with the theme of words that you're raising. Words about God, that's the natural world praising God. Words from God, that's a divine teaching. And words to God, that's the prayer for purity and sinlessness. And that this becomes a kind of meditation on words coming from where. By the way, I don't think that gam actually means also here, or even very often. Gam is an emphatic word, probably means something more like indeed here. I don't think it means also, and I don't think it suggests that it's late. I hear what you're saying. That is not, in my opinion, mishachnea. It's not convincing as a biblical Hebrew reading. That's a little bit of a projection of modern Hebrew onto biblical Hebrew. One of the challenges people like me who grew up speaking modern Hebrew have is that all speakers of modern Hebrew assume that they know biblical Hebrew because they know Hebrew. And we end up projecting certain modern Hebrew grammar onto biblical grammar. I do not think that gam means also here. In fact, I can tell you gam does not mean also here. But I think your point about the words part is actually very moving and very important. And the silent words, I think the association with the silent theophany, the silent revelation of God at Malachim is actually quite important and powerful. Related to that, confusingly, is the idea that God is beautiful and also that God is evasive and we don't see God, right? The revelations of God that play with visibility, invisibility, or visibility and impermissibility of looking are quite rich and complex. Yeah, I think Harvey was next. Ari, is that right?
Yeah, please, a quick question because we have to wrap it up. Thank you, Harvey.
Yeah, it's just nice to see this reference from Ekev Rav and that Yiddish expression, Torah is the bestest Choira, the same concept. And then I was Googling this term a little bit, and I came up with a sefer that was written in Venice in 1711 called the Ekev Rav as well. So I guess this is a very important concept, but it's nice how the Yiddish even reduced it to that in terms of that comment about what Torah really is.
Well, one of the things that you find already in the Bible and then very strongly in rabbinic literature is the tension between the idea that the reward of Torah is something that God is going to do, that God is going to, if you, Harvey, do this, then God will reward you by doing Y, versus a more, let's call it naturalistic or organic understanding of reward, which is that if you engage with this, it is in and of itself rewarding and it will enrich you on its own. And there's even debate among scholars about when Devarim says, the Haya'im Shamoa. Is God saying, if you do this, I will do that, and if you do the other thing, I will do something else? Or is it saying, if you do this, there will be reward? But you're blocked. You're muted, Harvey. But
yeah, it's the same concept of Torah Lishma, to study.
Yeah, the notion, for example, that you have in Pirkei Avot, schara shel mitzvah mitzvah, the reward of a mitzvah is a mitzvah, or which might mean the reward of a mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. I'm not sure it really means that originally, but it can come to mean that. So yeah, I think that's actually quite important. And in general, by the way, Bible scholars really argue about this, that how often in the Bible, when God says, if you do this, I will do that, is God saying, if you do this, then I will actively step into the world, exercise my agency, and do this? And how often does God mean, if you do this, X will happen? In wisdom literature, it's very often the latter. Like, if you dig a pit, you will fall into it. That doesn't mean God's going to give you a little kick in the tuchus and you'll fall in. It means that there's a kind of a natural outcome built in.
Okay, Alita, last question.
I guess this sort of goes along with the error of comparing biblical Hebrew to present day Hebrew. When we're studying or talking about nature and how we read nature to the Bible and what it means, is there a danger also in imposing our views of nature? Meaning, I think about all these people saying, I see God when I go on my hikes. And yeah, we're wearing our REI hiking shoes and we've got comfortable clothing on. if it's sunny and hot, we have a hat and we have cooling things on our neck. And I'm thinking in biblical times, nature was hell. I mean, you know, it's the desert, it's hot, you don't have air conditioning, you may not have the same clothing. When we're talking about nature in biblical times, do we have to be aware of those differences, and how, if at all, might that affect our interpretation of these Psalms and of anything that references nature in that context?
Yeah, so that's really interesting, and I think it could be you know, a whole nother discussion, because on the one hand there is the terror of nature, but on the other hand you do find a lot of texts that imagine tremendous intimacy with nature, and actually I would say that in a world that has not yet turned the natural world into a commodity, there is a much greater feeling of intimacy with nature than many moderns have. Right? I mean, who has a greater feeling with nature? A greater feeling of nature? A farmer who is baked in the sun every day, or a guy who wakes up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan and, you know, has to go to a certain park to find a tree? Do you know what I mean? Like, it really does cut both ways. On the one hand, nature is more scary. On the other hand, nature is much more organically connected to us in the ancient world. Maybe I'll end with this, you know, just as an example of what I mean by this biblical Hebrew thing. Say to a modern Israeli, what does the word "ve" mean? And every Israeli will say, of course, "ve" means and. However, one of the challenges of biblical Hebrew is that "ve" means and or but. And many times when you see the word "ve," it actually means but. It is a shift of meaning. Or, you know, the word "ki," which a modern Hebrew speaker thinks "ki" means because. "Ki" is an emphatic word. It can mean indeed. It can mean furthermore. It can mean moreover. It just, biblical Hebrew is just different. And that's part of the joy, you know, of actually learning languages as they unfold over time. So, okay.
So let's wrap up as follows. First of all, just to defend Ahuva, Ahuva is a biblical scholar. I just want to make sure you know Shai. So she is also she's a modern Hebrew speaker, but a biblical scholar. So more for discussion, I guess, for you and Ahuva to study together in the future, and be it as it may. You chose this topic. You chose Psalm 19 to teach. So if we were having a follow-up program, what would be your next Psalm? What's your next on the list that we would study with you? I assume you chose this for a reason. What would you choose next, and why? And then we'll wrap it up.
I think probably since we ended up in the journey towards a personal relationship, I would then look at one of the Psalms of Lament, like Psalm 88 or something like that are really about having a relationship with God that is so personal that you can even say to God, "God, I don't understand what you're doing and you're hurting me terribly." I think some of those texts are incredibly moving. Psalm 88 is a text that I've argued in print is a text about coming to God from the pain of chronic illness and saying, "God, I just don't get this." So I probably go in that very different direction where the intimacy with God really begins to play itself out.
And do you have any favorite books you can recommend to people who want to follow up and study Psalms, like that people should be reading or would want to know?
Oh, that's hard. It depends how comfortable they are reading Christian scholars. I think
Ahuva will
if you're
definitely
interested,
do it, so throw out the name.
if you're interested in the spirituality of the Psalms, I would recommend some of the works of Walter Brueggemann, even though he has a complicated relationship with Jews, in my opinion, with Judaism. But I actually think in terms of making the spirituality of the Psalms accessible to a lay reader, that's actually quite helpful. Then there's stuff in the Jewish community that's dated. There's a book that some people might like to look at by Nahum Sarna. That's like I forget what it's called. That's a reading of like 15 Psalms. The problem is those readings are a little dated. But really, I would recommend straight up commentaries. I think there are, I'm happy if you want, I'm happy to send people a list of some of the commentaries that I think are strongest at different things. Like if you're interested in biblical Hebrew, you don't read Walter Brueggemann. If you're interested in spirituality, you read Walter Brueggemann. If you're interested in biblical Hebrew, you read different folks. I'm happy to, if there's actually anyone interested in that level of granularity, I'm happy to send an email laying out some of those choices. I'd be delighted to do that.
Great, thank you. So this is the end of our 21st Annual One Month Scholar series entitled "The Text Demands Interpretation." But I think, maybe we should have called this "The Text Demands Interpreters," because we've had guides. All of the faculty from Hadar have been guides for us through text that we have never seen before and we learn, text that we have seen and we say every day, whether it's in the Amida or in Pesukei DeZimra, and we thought we knew and didn't know. So I wanted to thank you for creating Hadar, and you for being our teacher tonight, and you for bringing us such great teachers and having such a great faculty at Hadar. Look forward to having CSP work with you and host you personally and other teachers from Hadar in the future as we continue on our goal, which is just to bring Judaism, Jewish knowledge, opportunity study with the best Jewish teachers to as many people as possible in the Jewish world, and to grow commitment to Judaism and through knowledge. That is our goal at CSP. That is definitely your goal. It's been a pleasure working with you and your team. Thank you for the excellent teaching tonight. I wanted to thank all of you, from Lee Evans, one of our newest legacy members, I believe from Idaho, to Deborah and Ed Heyman, longtime supporters of CSP, and our honorees, to Uva Ho, our resident Bible scholar in Orange County, California, Neil Eisenberg in Philadelphia, Deb Schubach in the snow in Boston, Lindy Kaiser in New York, Ruth Lavore, maybe relatively new to CSP, Marion Adler, all of you. I see David Phillips, and I can't thank all of you. There's so many of you. There's 130 people still online right now. So I just want to thank you for supporting CSP, but more importantly, for committing yourself to Jewish learning. And it's great to see that. Thank you, everybody. Have a very safe and great week. Lots of coming up with CSP. And if you go to hadar.org, I'm sure lots coming up at Hadar. Please continue your learning. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you,
Rabbi Shai, thank you for some great teaching. Good night, everybody. Time for dinner with my kids. Nice to see you all. Bye-bye.